Hello, Internet. This is Matthew, and welcome to the Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. This is not, as you might suppose, a podcast about surviving the zombie apocalypse. At that point, all hope is lost, and you should run into the horde of zombies. No, this is a podcast in which a variety of subjects will be examined using philosophy in the hopes of gaining greater insight and perspective. This podcast won't solve all your problems, but it will make you think. Your mileage may vary, normies not allowed. Okay, episode 4 of the Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. Before I get started with today's topic, I wanted to draw the audience's attention to something my friend John had mentioned about my last episode, where I reviewed the arguments made in CGP Gray's video, "The Rules for Rulers." John thought that I had simplified Gray's arguments by focusing on material conditions, but by focusing on politicians' material interests, and that you can include moral interests in Gray's arguments, but ultimately any influence you have is based on material interests and power. You can't get anything done without power. And that's a fair interpretation of Gray's arguments. Gray didn't really talk about morality or moral interests at all. So that's why I didn't talk about it. I pretty much took the arguments at face value. But that's why I was encouraging people to watch the video themselves and make up their own mind about Gray's arguments. My interpretation is certainly not the only possible interpretation, but as to whether morality derives from power, that's a whole other can of worms that we're not going to get into right now. Actually, what we're going to get into is history. So, this is a philosophy podcast. What's more relevant than talking about history? And I actually want to begin by quoting from Will Durant's The Age of Voltaire. This is volume 9 of his The Story of Civilization series. I think there were 11 volumes. That's a very good series. If anyone hasn't read it, I would highly recommend getting it in its entirety. But the first quote is from the 18th century mathematician and physicist Émilie de Châtelet. And she says, quote, "What does it matter to me, a French woman living on my estate, to know that Eagle succeeded Haquin in Sweden, and that Ottoman was the son of Ortegrul? I have read with pleasure the history of the Greeks and the Romans. They offered me certain great pictures which attracted me, but I have never been able to finish any long history of our modern nations. I can see scarcely anything in them but confusion. a host of minute events without connection or sequence, 1,000 battles which settled nothing. I renounce a study which overwhelms the mind without illuminating it. And now, for approximately a decade, I believe, Emily de Châtelet was the mistress of the great Voltaire. Now, Voltaire is known as one of the preeminent Enlightenment historians, and he took inspiration from Emily de Châtelet's denunciation of history. So I think it would be helpful to read an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to her on the subject. So Voltaire said, quote, "If amid so much material rude and unformed, you should choose wherewith to construct an edifice for your own use, if, while leaving out all the details of warfare, all the petty negotiations, that's hard to say, which have been only useless knavery, if, while preserving those details that paint manners, you should form out of that chaos a general and well-defined picture, if you should discover in events the history of the human mind, would you believe you had lost your time?" So that's definitely a good place to start. And I wanted to talk about this because I see the U.S. as a particularly ahistorical country. Now that doesn't mean, of course, we don't have a history, although we are a young country, relatively speaking. I mean, France or Britain or any other number of countries have a far deeper history to look back on, far longer history to look back on than do Americans. But I don't think it's just that. I think this ahistorical attitude was built into the country from its founding. And I say that because the founding fathers were looking to break with European history. They were looking for a fresh start. They wanted to wipe the slate clean. And I think Thomas Paine, I want to say it's in his Rights of Man, although I don't remember exactly. He says somewhere about, what is America? America is a fresh start. America is a time for and a place for people to, for sort of history to begin again, for people to right past historical wrongs and to begin a new age of tolerance and equality. And I mean, I can understand why the founding fathers might have felt that way. Obviously, if you look at European history, it was a very bloody affair. And America was one of the first democracies to one of the first successful democracies in the modern world. So in a sense, they were starting new, and in a sense, they were beginning again. But even conceding all that, I think that our ahistorical worldview causes us to not be able to engage in certain kinds of arguments, and to not be able to analyze ourselves and current events in a way that we would be able to if we had a more solid grounding in history. Because, well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I mean, I think it's when I talk about like my interest in history, say, I'll start with that. I'm not interested in, say, who succeeded who in the throne on the throne in Sweden. I'm not really that interested in a long, laborious, detailed account of the 7 Years' War. You know, that there are, I guess, subfields in history, or there are parts of history which I don't personally care for, or I don't personally find very interesting. But what I mostly find interesting when I'm talking about history is the history of ideas. What that is also known as intellectual history. So, you know, Voltaire talks about the history of the human mind. That's basically what he means, is intellectual history. History of certain religions, or history of certain philosophies, or certain political or economic views, or cultural views. History of art and science. So that is probably the main reason why I'm so fascinated by history. Because you can present me with you know, any idea. And what I really want to know first and foremost is the history of that idea. So, for example, democracy. It is after the American Revolution. Of course, there was the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and whatever you think about any of these revolutions specifically, they led to many things. But what I want to focus on is the dominance of democracy. So democracy came to be thought of as the best form of government, the form of government which makes government legitimate, and you know, if you listen to any neoconservatives talk about their justification for advocating for invasions of certain countries, or harsh economic penalties, or whatnot on these certain countries, their response normally is, well, we have to export democracy. We have to expand democratic norms and values to the whole world, because this is the best system. And if it's the best system, then everybody should have these, should experience this best system. But I bring all this up because, like, what's the history of democracy? Well, I mean, that's a very fascinating question. And I think most historians talk about the ancient Athens that Greek city-state, the home of Plato and Socrates, as the first ever attempt at democracy. Now, of course, it was a very limited form of democracy. It was only what was it? I want to say like 25% of the population. It was like all propertied males or something to that effect. But still, I mean, compared to what was compared to the other Greek city-states, or just compared to other political systems at the time, it was insanely radical. Like no question about it. Like everybody thought Athens was totally insane and would, just everything would ultimately fail. But then you can also look at other democracies throughout history, both direct democracies like in Athens and republics. So many people, when they're trying to illustrate the negative outcomes that can arise from democracy, they would bring up the Weimar Republic. In case anyone has forgotten, republics are, when we talk about democracies, there are two kinds basically. There are direct democracies and there are republics. Direct democracy just means like every citizen votes for every issue, every policy, every law. And republics are where I vote for somebody and they vote for certain laws and policies and whatnot. But of course, everyone knows that the Weimar Republic was a pretty shabby business. It was a fairly unstable government, and of course, it led to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party, coming about. And so some people would, kind of use that as a debating point and say, well, you can see, like it's just a good example of how a democracy can struggle and ultimately fail. So I don't know how well I'm talking about the history of democracy here, but I'm trying to illustrate the point that if we're going to talk about democracy, or if we're going to talk about anything really, it helps to know the history of that institution, of that idea, of that culture. And often really what I see, particularly in the United States, is a myopia, which restricts people, a myopia which causes people to analyze issues as in only in this current context, only in the context of the 21st century. And of course, I mean, there are certain issues or topics where, yeah, that makes sense. But there are, I think, an equal number of issues, if not more issues, which, if you only look at them from the narrow lens of today, then you are really missing the point in extraordinarily unhelpful ways. So I think an example for right now, well, actually, I can think of a couple examples from related to current events. But one, of course, people have heard of the protests going on in Cuba right now. And what I find striking is the systematic lack of people who are bringing up the America's long and ugly history with Cuba. We have been that the U.S. has been attempting to mess with Cuba and kind of overthrow Cuba and destabilize Cuba for a really long time. We can't stand having a so-called communist country in the hemisphere. And of course, people remember, or should remember, that JFK almost destroyed the world, almost ended history over Cuba, because the U.S. had put missiles in Turkey, pointing at the Soviet Union, and so Soviet Union retaliated by putting missiles in Cuba, pointed towards the U.S. So I think we would have a better understanding of what is going on in Cuba, if we remember the the history of U.S.-Cuban relations. And what I'm often hearing, except from certain progressive commentators, is a focus on, the Cuban government is a horrible, repressive communist dictatorship, and these people are rising up wanting freedom. I think I was listening to Ben Shapiro, and he mentioned something about it's a disgrace that America has allowed a communist dictatorship off of our shores, or something to that effect. Now, I'm not defending the Cuban government. If you look at Cuban history, it is clear that Castro's regime was not very friendly. I'll put it like that. I think freedom of the press and freedom of speech in general there has been terribly limited. Limited in unacceptable ways. And there's plenty of other criticisms you can level at them. Although, again, many people would argue that a good bit of the economic issues Cuba has had, and issues with food shortages and medicine and whatnot, difficulty getting the proper resources and supplies, is at least partly caused by the U.S. Attempting to prevent Cuba from getting certain supplies and resources, making sure that the ships going to Cuba are turned away. But I don't hear that. I don't hear that at all. The other example that came to my mind is the Iraq War. But actually, I think it would be better in this context, or in this conversation, to expand it to just the war on terror as a whole. I hardly hear people, again, except for specific commentators, I hardly hear people talk about the history of the War on Terror, and just the American foreign policy as a whole. Like, it's insane the number of countries, if I could find this, the number of countries which the U.S. Has tried to overthrow. Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head, or I can't find it right away. But or just the weird ally, not even weird, the strange evil allies we've had. How we armed rebels in Afghanistan who were fighting the Soviet Union because, of course, we took a hard communist line. And those Afghan rebels, what did they do after the Soviet Union was expelled? They started attacking us. they decided that they had defeated one enemy. Now the U.S. was their enemy, but we had funded them, and they were using our weapons. I don't hear this when we're talking about American foreign policy, when we're talking about American interests overseas. I don't hear people talk about the history at all. And when they do talk about history, it's often a very whitewashed form of history in which the United States looks good in every fight, and any of our enemies always look bad. I'll give one more example. I think I'm kind of rambling here, but well, yeah, I'll give this example. This is an example for all my right-wing or libertarian listeners out there. At least the ones that are critical of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. Something I didn't learn in school, but I had to learn, I think, on my own, was how the U.S. turned away a lot of Jewish refugees. And I think the FDR's administration had, I don't think, I'm almost certain they had something to do with that. There's just, they didn't want them, so they turned them away. And those people, of course, got sent back to various European countries, and many of them ended up in the gas chambers. I do hear a lot of people talking about the Japanese internment camps, actually. But I guess this is an example I bring up because of people try to talk about World War II, in which the U.S. had no flaws, in which the U.S. did everything right, was on the right side of every issue, and any missteps we just hush hush, we don't talk about. Now, and actually, on point of fact, I would say that the U.S. was justified to get involved in World War II, and I think they were on the right side, or they were on the side that I would have been on had I been around during that time. I think they were on the moral side. But I mean, even today, there are arguments and disputes about World War II, and course, that connects with the War on Terror because the people kind of, I think when people were trying to justify the Iraq War, they often, I want to say they compared Saddam Hussein to Hitler. I think it was Christopher Hitchens who mentioned that he thought Saddam Hussein combined the worst of, like, was it fascism and communism or something? And then I know, and I think in a different context, Hillary Clinton called Vladimir Putin Hitler. So here people are using these, using World War II. Well, that's not really true in Hitchens' case, necessarily. No, I guess it is. Well, anyway, these people are using World War II as a justification for current interventions, because most people say that was a necessary intervention. So what are all these examples leading up to? All these examples are leading up to the need to study history and study it carefully. And I think that's a need because we are historical beings. I mean, the U.S. may be a young history, but it still has 200-something years of history to look back on. And you can see the difficulty we're having right now to talk about history, and to have historical conversations, and to talk about how history applies to, or how it's related to, what we're experiencing today. Like how history is taught in schools, in K through 12. Now it's really not taught very well in K through 12 schools, but people are very, like, they're having arguments about what should be taught, like what kind of history should be taught to children, what kind of history should not be taught to children. To mention, I think it was the former president, Donald Trump. He was trying to institute, he didn't get to because he didn't get second term, but he wanted to institute in his second term, what's it called? The 1776 Project, which was supposed to be a counter to the 1619 Project. But here we have, of course, two remarkably different views of American history, particularly when it's surrounded by questions regarding race and slavery and the economic inequality associated with that. But you have the liberals and you have the conservatives, and they can't agree on how history should be taught, and they feel like each side is indoctrinating their children with bad history, with a history which is not factual. It's like, well, was America founded on by like hypocritical racists, or was it founded on these great universal revolutionary principles? I mean, there's really not a good answer to that from where I'm standing, because as far as I'm concerned, it's both. But it's this continual tension, I think, because Americans, more and more people are bringing up this history, but I think it's also somewhat resented by certain people, or at least certain people do find it rather confusing. I guess another policy example. This episode's a little more policy heavy than I was expecting it to be, but the question of reparations for people of African descent. People have also talked about it related to for Native American Indians, but I'm just going to talk about the first kind for now. Does the U.S. government owe people reparations? Owe people of African descent reparations? That's kind of it's a moral question, I suppose, but it's also related to history because if you look at, I think it's Thomas Sowell, the economist. He's not a historian, but he makes the argument that, no, actually, I'm sorry. I was thinking about Milton Friedman. I know Sowell has said other things, but I was thinking about Milton Friedman because I know Milton Friedman said in a lecture somewhere that you can't say that America's wealth was built on slavery. It's like you just can't. He said that's not really how wealth works, and the wealth generated by those slaveholders, it's not the wealth we have today. That's just he thought that was a fundamental misunderstanding of economics and how money flows, and he didn't think that kind of wealth transferred through time in the way that some people say it does. But then you have I remember reading a New York Times, a long New York Times piece by what's her name? I think she's the founder of Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I remember the whole basis for her article, and it was pro reparations. Her arguments were pro reparations, but her arguments were mostly based on the idea that that wealth did transfer down throughout history, and because African Americans didn't start accruing wealth until around the Civil War, in large part, and white Americans, of course, started acquiring it well before then. That inequality, that economic inequality has persisted because they didn't have the same starting line. They didn't have the same starting points. It's like there's a lot. It's like races around a track. It's like the white people started at one line and the black people started at another line, and then they started running. And then, the person who started the line farther down is probably going to be the one that wins the race. So, but that we're talking about history here, and actually, the interesting thing is history is very political. Now we don't think about it like that. We kind of think, history is just a bunch of facts about what happened at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. Or at the battle. that's not the thing. People think history is just a bunch of facts about what happened at Pearl Harbor or Normandy or Dresden. That's sort of how we think about these things. Of course, that's just a sign of how broken the U.S. education system is, because it's kind of like science. What I hear people like, science is facts. So that's what science is. Science is facts. It's like, no, That's not really a good way to conceptualize science. Like, science is the scientific method. Science is a way of understanding the world around us, the natural world. It's a method for acquiring data, and kind of constructing models of kind of how the world works based on that data. And generally, of course, you start with hypotheses, and then you collect data and kind of compare your hypotheses to the data, and so you kind of start with more creative work, and then you go on to try to match I guess, how you think it should work with how it does work. But it's like, so in a similar vein, people see history as like, oh, history is just facts, just a collection of facts about, dead people. And in fact, there's, I don't know if I have it in front of me, another quote from Voltaire: history is nothing but a pack of tricks that we play upon the dead. But it's incorrect to say like, oh, history is just a bunch of facts. Now, I mean, when was Thomas Jefferson born? Like, okay, there's a fact for that. I can tell you. I don't know. I didn't experience it. I wasn't there. But I can tell you what the historians say, like, that based on the records they found. Like, okay, Thomas Jefferson was born. Da 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 da. But that's not like the main thrust of history. In the same way that scientific facts aren't the main thrust of science. History just is it's really the study of man through time, and it's the study of man through time through documents, basically, through the study of man through time, starting with the written word, starting with when people began kind of keeping records. Now, of course, there's prehistory as well, but I think that's when you start talking to anthropologists and archaeologists and evolutionary biologists. I think that's probably a good description. And so, a historian of in the Enlightenment. I'll say I'm probably going to do an episode about the Enlightenment pretty soon. Like, the historian of the Enlightenment looks at a lot of the Enlightenment texts, looks at the records of the various governments around during that time, looks at people's letters, and tries to construct a picture of what life was like then, what people thought, what they said, what they did. So it's, I mean, really, history is people, is stories about people, but it's stories that are based on. They should be, but they're stories that should be based on rigorous research and documentation. If you pick up a history book and they don't have any sources, they're just like spewing words on the page, well, probably not a reputable historian. So I would expect a historian of the Enlightenment to, have read Voltaire, have read Rousseau, Diderot, or studied like the reigns of Louis the 15th and 16th, to, seeing the kind of economic policy of France, say, during that time. So if you're interested in people, you should be interested in history. If you're interested in now, if you're interested in current events and politics, you should be interested in history. Again, the study of man, it's the study of man through time. Now, we all live in a certain time, but this time is the product of all other times. And our ideas are the product of all the other ideas that preceded ours. And I mean, you can think about anything from the economy to literature to science. I mean, all these things have a history, to government and politics. It all has a history. You can study it all through time. And to study it all through time gives you a breadth and a depth that I think helps you better understand why things are the way they are. And it sort of frustrates me when people aren't willing to do that, because I think it kind of it's sort of anti-intellectual, if I may be so blunt. It kind of signals to me that there's a certain level of inquiry which someone just doesn't care about. But then I have to take their opinions on certain things a little less seriously. So I don't like taking shots at people. And he says that and proceeds to take shots at people. But of course, I do another podcast with my friend Matt, and he's a ANCAP. But I bring this up because ANCAP is sort of an extreme or radical form of libertarianism, and I don't see a lot of libertarians engage with the history of, they don't engage maybe with economic history, or they don't engage with the history of the state and governments. I see them as kind of like the founding fathers, people who are trying to break away from the past and do something entirely new. Now, I guess I'm not trying to disparage the founding fathers per se when I say that. I guess I am disparaging libertarians when I say that, but libertarianism is an ideology which you can't really have anywhere else except the United States. It doesn't really make sense anywhere else, because other countries really just have a very different relationship with the government than we do. We have an ANCAPs wouldn't like it when I say this, but we have a pretty antagonistic relationship with our government. So we have a government. Most people aren't out in the streets attempting to abolish government, or most people are anarchists, for whatever reason. But even so, it doesn't mean people like government. It doesn't mean people trust government. Most people, I think, probably just see government as a necessary evil. But that's why something like libertarianism kind of came about, is because of how hostile Americans are to government. And if you think about how the Articles of Confederation failed, that's really a good illustration. the federal government realized that it really didn't have any power over the states, and then I think there was some economic issues, which led to some uprisings by the common man. Washington and others squashed them. Then they had another constitutional convention. They were like, "Hey, this government can't do anything. We need a government that's going to actually do something." So they created a stronger federal government, which ultimately led to the one we have now. But that's an example of people were so suspicious of a central authority that we tried the Articles of Confederation, which basically had no central authority, which was very decentralized. I think taxes were optional, for example. If you want people to pay taxes, you can't make them optional. It won't work. People won't pay taxes if you don't put a bayonet in their face and say pay up. So, and I think there were it wasn't just taxes, there were other issues as well. Or the fact that we have a Second Amendment, say. Now, it says well-regulated militia, so I think certain people on the right should probably go back to those little booklets that have the Constitution in them and read that part. Not sure it says what they think it says, but regardless, that provision, many people would argue, was put in because the people need sort of a last resort against a government which goes too far. And so, what is that last resort? Well, guns, firearms. The people can have armed uprisings against the federal government in the hopes that, that they will squash whatever oppression and tyranny they're having to experience. Most countries don't have that. Not to say you can't get a firearm in most countries, but most countries don't have it enshrined into their constitution that you have the right to keep and bear arms. I think Mexico does, I want to say. Probably there might be other countries that do as well, but it's not that many. So this has been a bit of a ramble, but I think I'm making clear that why history is important. And I guess to kind of put it in a phrase, let's say, history offers perspective. And for that reason, I don't think it's that strange to talk about history on a philosophy podcast. I've often said that philosophy offers perspective. But so does science, by the way. It's like science, history, philosophy. They all offer a broader perspective, which really deepens your understanding of the world around you. But it's just a different kind of perspective, and you can't look for different answers, or you ask different questions studying history, philosophy, science. But I think if you're looking for if you're looking for that philosopher's perspective, or if you're looking for that broad, that big picture perspective, which philosophy should offer you, then you should couple that with history. If you're trying to study man, you can study man in your life. Like you can go out and live, experience the world, do different kinds of things, talk to different kinds of people. You'll definitely get some ideas of how you think the world is, or how it works, or how people tick. But if you want to understand even further how people tick and how the world works, then you should understand it, how it used to be. This will one day be history, right? The 21st century, one day, assuming we don't have we don't annihilate ourselves via nuclear war or something. In the 23rd century, people will look back on historians will be writing about the 21st century. We are a part of history, and we will one day be in the history books. We will one day be written about by historians. I mean, not any one of us particularly, but this time period will be written about and talked about by historians. I only wish I would be around to know what people would say about this time in a couple hundred years. But I mean, that should give you a sense of not camaraderie, but if you think of history, if you think of yourself as part of history, that could benefit history education and just benefit your appreciation of history as a whole. If it's not just a bunch of dry facts about dead people, but about the ongoing human experiment, and all the things people have tried and done, the good, the bad, the ugly, the most moral people and the most immoral people, philosophers and saints and kings and peasants and farm workers and venture capitalists, and poets and playwrights and biologists and geologists, and just the whole totality of human knowledge and experience. If all that matters to you, if you're interested in that, then you should study history. Then you should want to think like a historian. And I actually think that studying philosophy helps you think historically. So it's like, okay, everyone knows that old saying, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? It's like, well, this is a philosophy podcast, so what comes first, philosophy or history? Actually, I think when I was a little kid, I was quite interested in history. So actually, I think my interest in history came before my interest in philosophy. But my interest in philosophy has given me a greater appreciation of history. And I think that's probably because philosophy, it brings up the question, does philosophy progress? Again, I won't get into that at this time, but I think history is more, or philosophy is more interested in kind of the arguments of people who came, or arguments that people made in the past. It's sort of a historical discipline by default, and it's not necessarily something which progresses, I guess, in the same way that, say, biology progresses. So I mentioned evolutionary biology earlier. If you want the most up-to-date understanding of evolutionary biology, you're not going to read Darwin. Now, obviously, every evolutionary biologist is going to study Darwin because he really founded the field. But so much came after him, and people have so much more nuance and information than Darwin did, that he only gives a very incomplete picture. With philosophy, it's not exactly the same. I mean, I suppose if you fall more in the analytic tradition, I'm talking here, of course, about the analytic continental split that I think I mentioned in episode 1. You might make the argument that analytic philosophers try to be more like scientists, and therefore that's progress. Continental philosophers might not feel the same way, but I really don't get the sense that a lot of these philosophical problems we talk about ever truly get resolved. And it's just kind of a lot of the same ideas are talked about. A lot of the same ideas are debated. So it's like free will. Do we have free will? No. At least I would say no. But is there going to be an end to that debate? Unlikely. I mean, maybe. I'm not one to say certain things are possible, but I would highly doubt that. I really don't even think. I mean, I could give you information that neuroscientists have found and experiments they ran, and I could explain to you why I think that illustrates that we don't have free will. But I don't think that closes the case entirely. I don't think, or rather, I don't think that's going to answer everybody's objections, and therefore everyone's going to conclude that free will is an illusion. Philosophy is kind of is a collection of a lot of questions like that, which really aren't ever fully resolved. The debate just goes on. The debate just continues in all times and places. Or democracy is a perfect example. Some people nowadays are beginning to question democracy with the rise of the Dark Enlightenment and anarcho-capitalism and just other ideas floating around. People aren't so sure anymore that democracy is the way to go. And there are still people who say in the U.S. They want more democracy, and they're upset with the government because it's not very democratic. Are we ever going to conclusively decide, like, okay, democracy is a horrible system or democracy is a great system? Probably not. Have we fully decided that monarchy is a bad system? Not really. I mean, that they've kind of gone out of fashion. Doesn't merely mean the debate isn't there still. I mean, the fact that people are still debating in the UK whether or not to abolish the monarchy or not, even though the monarchy doesn't have that much political power, I think that shows that the debate still goes on. And so because the debate still goes on, I think philosophy is, or the philosophy of history, the history of philosophy is very important when you're studying philosophy. And maybe in a sense that you don't necessarily have to know a whole lot of history of science to be a scientist. I'm sure most of them know a good bit, but you don't really need to know the history of molecular genetics to be a molecular geneticist. I don't know if any scientists are watching. Maybe you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. That's the sense I get. But yeah, I think that probably sums up my thoughts. Think more like historian, guys. That's what I try to do. And it doesn't give you all the answers. And there really aren't answers in history. It's similar to philosophy in the sense that the debate always goes on. Well, actually, the same could be said for science. Actually, the debate always goes on. I mean, for most intellectual endeavors, the debate always goes on. But again, if you want to understand the debate, you have to look at it through time. You have to see where the debate started. You have to see all the permutations of the debate, all the arguments and ideas put forward in all these various debates. I guess I'll conclude by mentioning how one of Friedrich Nietzsche's books is called The Genealogy of Morals. And what Nietzsche set out to do in that book was to understand the Judeo-Christian values as a historian. Like why did they come about? How did they come about? And why are they the way they are today? And many people within the Jewish community, they recognize, how Nietzsche's insights. They didn't always agree with some of his views, but they definitely understood where Nietzsche was coming from, and they understood why he was trying to look at morality, the evolution of morality, let's say, and they understood why, and they understood and agreed with a lot of his thoughts surrounding that evolution. The thought was the idea of turning the other cheek, for example, is really something you only need to do when you're a slave. So, according to the biblical stories, many people of Jewish descent were enslaved in Egypt. I assume that's actually a historical fact. Nietzsche kind of looked at that and said, well, no wonder they preached turn the other cheek. They had to. If your master slaps you, you can't slap your master back, or you get a beating, or you get killed or maimed, or something horrible happens to you. So what you do is you make it a virtue of turning the other cheek, of not doing anything, of not retaliating, of being the bigger man, so to speak. Because if you're an aristocrat and an aristocrat slaps you, you either fight him on the spot or you plot against him behind the scenes, because you're an aristocrat. You don't have to take that. Like, you're his equal. If he messes with you, you can mess with him back, and 10 times worse. Because you know your worth, you know you're great, and you won't tolerate it. Slaves don't have that luxury. And so I think that's a really good example of the importance of history and the value of history. Because Nietzsche was showing why the Jews adopted this morality. And of course, we're the inheritors of that morality. That can help you understand your own morality in your own time. We're less, it was even more so in Nietzsche's time. As time goes on, I guess Christianity might be having less of an influence But still, I would say it's the backdrop. I would say it's the background. It's in the background in our lives, and it's still influential to a large degree. I think that's a good place to leave off, though. Hope this wasn't too much of a ramble. Hope you got something out of it. Of course, if you're watching this live, then you know about my YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher. If you're not listening to this live, or you're listening to this on a podcatcher, now you know about my YouTube channel. You can go subscribe to that. I'm going to try to have a live stream this podcast every week. Not quite sure what time, or we'll figure that out. So, but that's I think going to try to be the format. I'm going to try to live stream the podcast on my YouTube channel, and then a couple days after that, upload it to the podcast feed, so I have time to edit the audio, give the listeners a more polished version. Since live streams aren't terribly polished. You can also check out my other podcast with my friend I just called out, Matthew Keck. It's Beyond Talking Points. That's also on this various podcatchers, and there's a YouTube channel associated with it. That's that podcast is more of a news and politics podcast, although we often talk about like philosophy and our various bedrock intuitions about certain issues. So yeah, I think that wraps it up for this time. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and take care.